Welcome back to our people analytics conversation. I'm Cari Bohley. I'm the Vice President of Talent Management for Peraton. And again, with me today is Dr. Fiona Jamison from Spring International. When we met last time, we started talking about the business case for people analytics and why it's important. Today's conversation is really about how you get started with people analytics in an HR organization. And so today, Fiona is going to walk us through that. So Fiona, before we get too deep into that, can you talk a little bit about what's happening in the industry around people analytics in the HR industry?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. As you said, we talked a lot about how important it is and the increasing nature of it being expected of folks in HR. And what we're seeing is there's a huge increase in this. In fact, across the market, what companies are doing in terms of HR and people analytics, it's only set to increase further. So, there's a recent study done that said it's going to increase by about almost 13% over the next 6 to 7 years, which just shows that it's going to be increasing in size in terms of a market and the things that people are doing. And the two things that people seem to be focusing in on the most are around payroll and compensation and talent analytics. So those seem to be the ones that are sort of outpacing. But companies are also doing engagement work and workforce planning and talent analytics and retention and all these like sort of recruitment analytics. So there's an awful lot going on. And we're also seeing some trends in the kinds of analytics that are happening. So people using more predictive stuff to try and determine, what's future behavior, future attrition or performance. We're also seeing a lot more with the natural language processing. So a lot of the stuff that ChatGPT can help folks in HR with, we're seeing an increase in that. Social network analysis, how people are connected, how people communicate with one another as we work to figure out how teams operate. And then, we're seeing some things like wearable technology that are influencing health and wellness programs. Employers asking employees to kind of have a wearable where they can kind of track things that are way above and beyond work, right? It's how we're behaving.
Almost to a scary point.
Exactly. A little terrifying, but
Yeah.
I think, with a good aim, right, that we're trying to be healthier in the workplace.
Right. I mean,
And then
because
we're
it has a
seeing some
huge
things.
impact.
Yeah, exactly. And I think then we're seeing some what's called digital twins, which is where you can kind of set up profiles of employees to kind of virtually look at how they might respond in certain situations or pilot tests without actually having to put them through it. So it's almost like simulation models. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on.
Yeah, and then I know, when I look at my network across different companies and different industries, the predictive analytics and natural language processing, I mean, that's what all of us are really starting to focus on from an HR people analytics standpoint, because it's become so it's much easier to get your hands on, and it's being built into all of the tools that we're using across HR.
Exactly. Exactly. We're going to be able to track and monitor all these kinds of things moving forward.
So we've got all of this available to us, and like I said, a lot of it is showing up in a lot of the tools we're using. What are some other ways that we really use these different types of trends, or apply these trends, apply these different ways to capture data? How do we get started? It still feels
Yeah.
really intimidating.
Well, it does. And I thought what I'd do is share a couple of case studies to share kind of like what people have done to give you a sense of what kind of outcomes you can be expecting if you embark on something like this. So the first one I'll talk about is a retail case study where the goal was really to understand the effect of leadership on employee engagement and store performance. So leaders said, yeah, we're going to invest in all this training, but how do we know it's actually having an impact on our employees? And so we looked at those who had participated in the leadership program thus far and those that hadn't. So you almost had like a test case. And then we gathered all kinds of information, all kinds of data from sales and profitability to average ticket, like how much each customer spent. We looked at turnover data, customer satisfaction data, employee engagement, and perceptions of leadership. And we put all this together in what we call structural equation modeling, but which is like a technique to look at the interrelationship between all these variables. And what we found out was that those leaders, as you would expect, hopefully, who've
Yeah.
been through the training were able to generate higher levels of customer satisfaction, higher levels of employee engagement. And as a result of that, actually led to reduced turnover, higher sales, and greater profitability. So it sort of provided an ROI for the client to be able to say, okay, let's continue investing in this leadership program because it ultimately has an impact on the bottom line. And the
Hmm.
people analytics piece of that is connecting all those dots, all those data points together. So I think that's a great example of,
Yeah.
do we do this investment and what impact does it have?
Well, and in being in the learning and development area in my company and leadership development, this is what we look for. This is what, we're always being challenged, across the board in learning and development, proving that case for ROI. And this is exactly what this is it. This
Yeah.
is this is what we want to do. This is what we should be striving for, is to get this type of data and to be able to prove that, the programs that we're putting together are having this type of an impact on the organization.
Yeah. And the challenge for a lot of companies with people analytics is all of this different data that I've just listed there
Mm-hmm.
isn't all available in one system. Right? Customer data is probably sitting in a different system to your engagement data versus your turnover versus like maturity of age of store and things like that, all the things that we were pulling in. So that's when we talk about how do you get started, step one is one of those things is how do you understand what data you already have and
Mm-hmm.
who owns it and where does it sit in the organization and which of those variables do you want to start pulling together? So I think, this is like a complete where we had access to all these things, but that's not always the case, right? Sometimes you got to
Right.
start real
Right.
simple with
Yeah.
just let's look at engagement, let's look at those that have been through the program and those that haven't. So I think that could be a good
Mm-hmm.
first step. Um, Another case study I thought I'd share with you was, and this is one that a lot of companies struggle with, is predicting turnover. So who's most likely to leave the organization and when? And for this organization, they had about 5,000 nurses and they were having really high turnover. And we were trying to figure out what were the root causes of that turnover and who was going to be the group most likely to leave next. So, we pulled in 3 years of engagement survey data. We looked at their actual turnover, and they had ratings of nurse burnout and overtime and performance ratings. And we also had leadership effectiveness and all of this kind of data. We pulled it together. We did different kinds of models for this problem. But what we were able to ultimately do is look at the trends and patterns and predict who was most likely to leave. We were also able to identify the biggest drivers of turnover, and it was the extent to which they were getting notifications of shift changes,
Mm-hmm.
frontline manager recognition, so nurses feeling like their supervisor was saying, hey, great job, thanks for staying that extra 5 minutes, or whatever that might
Mm-hmm.
be. And then the amount of time they got to spend in their home department. To a home
Okay.
department, but
Yeah.
when there's open positions, they get moved around a lot, and the
Right.
more
Yep.
they were moved around, the more likely they were to leave. So anyway, this led us to then being able to look at what was the actual cost of turnover, and that, identifying a specific amount to say, if you continue down this path, not doing these things, it's going to cost you X. Therefore, let's invest Y into some stay interviews, some manager training,
Mm-hmm.
some additional recognition supports. So, again, the goal here was to reduce turnover and save money, investing in the right things. But again, it all started with pulling this data together.
Yeah. No, and that makes a lot of sense. And looking at all of those things that it's not just HR data that we're looking at here. And in the previous example as well. I mean, there's a lot of different types of data that we're trying to pull together that makes a big picture, and even like what we would call maybe the perfect picture. So I think it's really interesting to see how all of these different factors contribute to, in this case, that predictive attrition for in this for the nurses in this example.
Yeah. Yeah. And, obviously with confidentiality of data, it wasn't like we then gave them a list and said it's John, Sue, and Katrina, right? But we were able to say, the night shift in this department is particularly struggling, right?
Right.
So let's talk about how they can have more support. and turnover did reduce. And I think the function of this is really spending time and effort and energy where HR can do
Yeah.
to solve the problem, because now they know kind of where the problem is. Now they can spend more time solving it, which I think is the
Right.
beauty of
Well,
analytics.
and working with the leaders too, and making them aware of what's happening in their organization so
Mhm.
that, because they have a huge part in it as well.
Yeah, exactly. Just letting them know that recognition was so important, and shift notifications. Right
Yeah.
there, it's two things that are very tangible that they could work on that would
Mm.
have a huge impact. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So, you had asked earlier on, like, how do you get started?
Yeah. Because it's really, 'cause there's so much out there. And, for most of us, we have one or two pieces of data that we can work with, and we don't have an analytics team or access to a consultant all the time. So yeah, how do we get started, and how do we focus on maybe those baby steps instead of trying to do do what you've done in those two previous case studies.
Mhm. And I think that the first thing to do is make sure you're asking a question. What are we trying to solve for? In one case, it was, do we reinvest in leadership training? And the others was, how do we reduce turnover? As soon as you know that initial question that's aligned with what the business needs, then it's easier, because then you can focus in on exactly what kind of data you're going to be looking at. So this is the kind of process that we go through, which is, first of all, understand what's important to the business. What's the question we're trying to solve for? Then evaluate your data. Take a look at what data you actually have and the quality of that. We usually establish buy-in by working with the data owners and having a meeting that says, all right, what have you got? How often is it collected? What's the quality of that data? Do you have confidence in it? That kind of thing. So you're actually kind of creating almost like a blueprint of everything that exists in your organization. And then you align the two. You say, okay, what's our research question? How do we reduce turnover? And what are the data sets that we can pull in? So that's probably the actual turnover calculation. Maybe it's your engagement data. Maybe it's um, usage of overtime, or whatever your factors might be. And then we typically recommend that you write a people analytics strategy, which is, here's the things we're going to explore, right? We're going to answer these three questions. The
Mhm.
reason I think this is an important step is that if you don't write it down, once you get going, everybody says, oh, could you
Yeah.
look at this? Oh, could you look at that? And if you've
Scope.
got limited time and resources, you
Yeah.
want to knock that down.
Yeah, we want to make sure that you've got a really tight scope so that you're only focusing on those things that are important, that you identified and everyone agreed to is
Mhm.
being important, the most important things that are going to impact the business.
Exactly, exactly. And then the next step is to assess your capabilities. So, sometimes we're helping an organization and we're saying, who do you have on staff already? Who's in your IT team? Who maybe just loves analytics and sitting in HR and just wants a stretch assignment, to kind of determine who you have on staff, who's available. Um, if you're lucky enough to have a people analytics team and you've set out a clear agenda, then they could be off and running. If you don't, it's about finding the right individuals. Now, you can either hire them from outside, people like us, or you can build the capability in-house. We typically recommend that you have at least one data scientist, someone who's building and pulling all the data together, one analyst who can run the models and understand the data, and then a third person who's usually an HR person who can communicate the results to other people. So, at a minimum, you probably have about 3 people involved,
Mhm.
at a sort of a raw minimum. Once you've had your people pull the data together and you've run your model, then the key part is really about, how do we report that out? What are our key insights? And I think that's something maybe we'll talk about next time, is like data visualization, and how do you communicate the results to other people so you keep getting requests and investment. But that's the process we go through. But the interesting thing is, usually about 80% of your time is spent on those first 3 things.
Yeah. Well, that's so important because if you don't know what you're trying to solve for, you're gonna struggle. I mean,
Yeah,
it's like
it's like
trying
panning
to,
for gold. What
yeah,
what are we looking for?
exactly.
Mhm.
Yes, yes. And trying to find that one little nugget, but you don't really know what that nugget is supposed to be. So
Exactly. Yeah.
and what I really like about that is I really like about the assess capabilities piece, because tapping into somebody who may have an interest, tapping into maybe one of your HR business partners, or maybe somebody who's in talent acquisition, somebody who's in the HR organization who maybe a diamond in the rough who has a passion for something like this that can do that stretch assignment. I think the assess and the build capabilities, I think really could be an opportunity within the HR organization to start to build out some analytics
Yes.
capabilities without having to make a huge investment.
Yeah. Exactly. One of the things that we often do here is we run people analytics workshops for HR business partners. For those people who kind of like data, but they're not
Yeah,
ever been trained in it because it's typically not part of an HR program in any way.
right, right,
So,
right.
we try to add those capabilities and build those skills, even if it's how do I ask the right question? How do I
Yeah,
pull data together? How do I know what models to ask for, right? They don't have to be statisticians. They just have to understand enough about this process to understand there's a beginning, middle, and end.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah. No, and I think the align with the business piece is also really important. But I think a lot of the times we know what those questions are. We know where the pain points are. It's just getting to how do we find the data to
mhm,
help understand why that's happening.
yeah,
So and we've got so many wonderfully smart people in our organization, in our HR teams. It's just, how do we get from identifying the problem to solving it is where we struggle. And this chart that you put together is a beautiful representation of how to do that.
yeah. And it doesn't have to take that long, right? If you have
Mhm.
a clear process, we've had analytics projects that have been like a week long, and then we've had some that are 6 weeks long,
Right.
or a year long. It really depends on what you're trying to gather and how good your data is. But, um, I think I've seen different models in different organizations about how to have people analytics departments. I've seen fully staffed people analytics departments, and I've also seen organizations do stretch assignment, special project type approach,
Yeah.
where people just get assigned on a topic they're interested in. And I
Hmm.
think I think that can be there's just as effective
Right.
for people to do that.
It's good.
Um, so one of the other things I thought I'd share is around what are some of the typical HR metrics or key performance indicators that we see being used when we're looking to determine what is the ROI of HR practices. And we see everything from time to hire or cost per hire. So in that talent acquisition space, how long is it taking us to fill positions? We see early turnover being used a lot, like
Hmm.
what's the percentage of turnover in the first 90 days, especially in sort of your manufacturing and retail environments where that tends to be really high. We've seen time since last promotion be, a metric that's used to look at, how are we progressing people through the organization. Revenue per employee, so how much are they generating? Of course, this varies based on industry, but in some services and financial services, that's really important. Billable hours, engagement ratings. Very few companies today do not do at least a once a year engagement rating to
Yeah.
see how committed their employees are. The cost of HR per employee, right? Looking at your ratios, how many HR representatives do you have per 100 employees? um, how much effort is going into that. And then actual turnover, very common metric that's
Mhm.
being used.
Yeah.
We're seeing more and more measures around the effectiveness of HR software. So is the time that HR is dealing with problems being solved by adoption
Hmm.
of different HRIS systems and platforms? And then for a lot of companies, absenteeism and,
Yeah.
the managing the no-shows, and especially in certain frontline
Right.
situations, folks that just don't show up for work.
Yeah.
Uh,
One of my favorites is regrettable turnover
mhm,
because certainly you have turnover and sometimes people leave and it's like, that's okay that that person left. And sometimes it really hurts when someone leaves. And there's a difference there. There's a difference because of the impact that it has on the team and perhaps on your customers when certain individuals leave. Perhaps and one way to capture that is through, maybe a 9 box rating or something like that.
yeah.
But regrettable turnover is something that myself, I've heard some of my peers in different companies are using that type of a measure as well
Mhm,
because of the significance of losing that top tier talent
yeah.
that we're all competing for
Mhm,
in the market today. And so being able to understand, one, identify who that talent is within your organization, and two, making sure we retain them, but also understanding the impact of loss when when we lose that talent.
Yeah. I saw a study recently that was looking at using social network analysis and regrettable turnover to predict like who would be, outside of like performance ratings, who are the people who are the most connected that if they left, networks would disappear.
Oh,
So
wow.
using network analysis that looked at the communications and relationships between different departments, they identified something like 15 individuals that if they were to leave, the sort of hierarchy would crumble.
Wow.
And what
That's
they
so
did,
interesting.
yeah. And so what's fascinating to me about that, it's looking at passive data to
Hmm.
identify and potentially an active problem, which is people, your top talent leaving. But it also enabled them to say, how can we reconfigure some of our networks so they're not all linchpinned on one person?
Yes.
What does that mean about knowledge sharing and relationship building? And so, it led to two.
Company culture.
Yeah, exactly. So it led to a couple of things. Like one was sort of how do we reconfigure our networks and how we operate? How do we share knowledge and do best practice sharing and lunch and learns? And then how can we make sure that we are continuing to re-engage those critical folks? Like if we've
Yeah.
got 15 people, how are we continuing to date them as employees
Right.
versus, you know, we haven't spoken to them really for the last 3 years to
Yeah.
realize they've built this network that can have a huge impact. So I think there's a lot of ways that data can be used to solve some of those problems.
Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest challenges we have is, we have to be able to, if you think about it, rehire our employees every day, right? To keep them, make them want to not just stay with us, but that they would choose us again
Hmm.
on any given day,
Yeah.
and not just, show up. So understanding why they do that and, the impact of them not doing that, I think what you just described really helps with that.
Hmm.
And that feels like it's really sophisticated to be able to do that. I don't know that most companies can do that, but I think having even something as simple as an engagement survey and engagement survey data will help at least give you the starting point of that. And that's something that feels like it's within reach for most of us.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the challenges I see with a lot of companies when they do engagement surveys is they focus in on the negative end. Where do we need to do better? How can we fix this? How can we solve for that? And they often ignoring the best of the best. Who is your best benchmark within your organization? What can you learn from them? Because they're in the same culture, getting the same pay and benefits for the most
Yep.
part. Like, why is it working there and not working other places? And so I think you can data mine your own data and find your best self and then replicate from that best self.
I think that is such if people take nothing else away from this talk, that is something really important to remember. That is such a great nugget to take away from this because we all have access to that when we're doing these surveys.
Mhm.
And I know that not everybody who's watching is going to do an engagement survey, but a lot of companies do. And we do have a tendency to focus on the negative and what are all of the gaps we have and what do we have to fix. And we have a tendency to not look at we may say, here's everything that we did great on, but then we set that aside on the shelf and it shows up on a slide, but we don't do anything else with that information.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
so I think that's such a great point.
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of what I call gold star best practice sharing, which is finding your stars, finding the gold in your own
Yeah.
organization, and then share it. Like, here's a leader over here that's doing Monday morning meetings and he's rocking them. And that's a practice we could all learn from, right? So, what are those nuggets that you can find and share? Um,
That's great. So these are the most common KPIs that we just talked about. So I know that you've got a couple of other things that you're going to share some more case studies with us on talent acquisition, talent retention, and talent management. So where are we going to start? Talent acquisition.
Yeah, so I thought I'd share a little bit, like, because I think people analytics can apply at any part of the employee life cycle, right? From the first minute we hire people to the minute we're trying to get them not to leave.
Mhm.
And so I think in terms of people analytics, we can also think about what kinds of data are you collecting, both qualitative and quantitative? So we're measuring stuff, but are we also gathering feedback at certain stages? And how can we use that to inform decisions? So with this example, we're working with a large company who had severe staff burnout and turnover, and they felt that they were struggling with their talent acquisition process to attract the right people. So we took a look at some external data as well as internal data. We said, what was the employee value proposition in the marketplace? When you click on Glassdoor or LinkedIn or whatever, what kinds of things were showing up for people? So we kind of did like a scrape of, what is the employee value proposition externally? Then we looked at the applicants. We looked at hiring data. So how many people were applying, how many were getting through the process, who was getting offers, and then who was declining. And we did a series of declining applicant interviews to find out, why are people not accepting the offer? Is it money? Is it commute? Is it didn't move fast enough? Like what's going down? And then we also tracked, a cohort of new employees over 30, 60, 90 days to see what their experience was. And then talk to hiring managers about what that process was like, getting a new employee. Did they have everything they needed? How was your role, etc. And we're able to calculate the cost of that turnover when it did happen. But all of that different points of data collection was like trying to build the picture. So we were trying to solve, why are people leaving, right? But
Right.
we were looking at different parts. What were people's expectations? What did that show up like when they first joined the organization? Where did it break down in the process? And as a function of this, they refined the recruitment process. They improved the onboarding program significantly. And they also actively managed their brand in the marketplace. So if
Yeah.
there's a negative review on Glassdoor, they would go back in and say, here's why, right? They would started tracking some of that stuff. And
Yeah.
ultimately, the number of people that were coming into the pipeline improved. And I truly think it was a function of an improved early experience.
Yeah.
So,
And, I think, we don't always realize how, just a couple of negative experiences with a candidate can have on an organization's application process.
mhm,
And even though we may turn somebody down, or they may have a poor interview process, that is still something that we need to manage,
mhm.
because word gets out,
Yeah,
and our applicants they're checking Glassdoor, they're checking Facebook or Instagram, or, and they're reading the comments.
yeah, yeah.
They're reading the
We are.
comments when we make a post.
Yes.
So to see what people are saying about the company. So being able to mine that data to understand what's happening and what people are saying, and that kind of feedback that's unsolicited, I
Yeah.
think is great. And it sounds like you also did was there some survey data too? I can't remember if
Yeah,
you
we
said.
did survey data of the new hires and of
Yeah.
the hiring managers as well. Yeah.
Okay.
We also
Yeah.
talked to the talent acquisition folks, the people, the recruiters,
Hmm.
and they even identified some parts of the process that was cumbersome,
Yeah.
where,
They
and it
because
was the
they
first
know.
time anybody had ever asked
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. Yeah. And they know. They all know. We all know where our processes are the weakest
Mhm.
and where they can use some improvement. And sometimes it's just the opportunity to do something about it
Well, and
is.
for them, it was the ability to say, we're losing 30% of our applicants because of X, Y, and Z. Once you can put a number to it, it becomes a much more
Yeah.
powerful story. One out of
Right.
three people aren't getting through the process because this is taking too long. That's
Right.
easier than saying, or more powerful than saying, the process is taking too long. If you can
Well, and then
say, we're losing one out of three.
yeah. And then you could tie revenue to that, or whatever, lost productivity or something else that senior leaders can then tie it back to the bottom line.
Exactly.
Because you could, once you start having once you have those numbers, you can start doing that.
Yeah, it is truly the power of numbers. And the more you can connect your experience data to your financial data, so the CFO sits up and listens, right? The
Mhm.
more powerful
Right.
people analytics becomes, right? Good
Right.
people
And that's your business
analytics.
case.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Um, the other example I thought I'd share, which is most companies are doing, is some, understanding once we've gotten hired our employees, what's their employee experience like and how engaged are they? It's a really good indicator of retention and, people's experience and what some of their trigger points are. And we typically recommend, engagement surveys, maybe some pulse surveys throughout the year, assessing your leaders and how effective they are, because they are one of the root causes for people to leaving.
Mhm.
If you're going through any kind of merger and acquisition process through growth, it's really important to look at the two cultures before they combine to see where the points are. And so we often use people analytics to say, it's a really innovative group and this is a not very innovative group, and let's find where the
Right.
commonalities are. And so for this organization, we were really trying to align leaders and employees with the basic beliefs. So it was about understanding, the extent to which they were engaged, but also engaged in what the company was trying to accomplish and their mission and purpose. And so, through these different instruments and tools, we were able to identify where are the gaps for people leaders, what were they missing out on, and how leaders weren't necessarily embodying the company's basic beliefs. And
Mhm.
so more training on that so that they were modeling what they wanted the employees to be doing. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, kind of identified the gap was in that frontline leadership area.
One of the things, before we move from that one of the things that, when I see the different types of surveys that are listed on here and different assessments that a lot of times are also a survey. What is the threshold, in your opinion, of like survey fatigue for an organization or for employees? You know, we have to get the data, but we have to balance that with the number of times we're going to employees asking them for data.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on that?
So I have an interesting position on that. I don't think it's survey fatigue. I think people get lack of action fatigue. People get annoyed with giving their feedback if they don't see any changes happening. So
Mm.
I always say you should survey as frequently as you can act. So if it takes you a year to go through your survey data, coordinate action and implement a solution, then you shouldn't be doing it more than once a year. Right. But if you have the ability to move faster than that, and, we've identified through a pulse survey, this is an issue, and for the next 3 months, we're going to work on it, and then we're going to take on another issue, then quarterly pulsing is fine. So it really is about how quickly you can act, not how quickly you can ask questions.
I just wrote that down. That's another nugget to take away
Yeah.
from this.
And I always say, like, people love to give their feedback.
Yeah,
You could ask me every day, like, what do you think we can improve? Well, let me tell you, I think we need to do this and that. They'll give you their opinion. They will get very frustrated very quickly if they
right.
keep getting asked and nothing gets changed. So
Yes,
that's
that
the
makes
balance I think
sense.
most companies should focus in on.
Yeah, that's a
But
great piece of advice. I'm so glad that you said that because I think a lot of us, I mean, it's a question that comes up all the time is, and every time we bring up a survey, oh, survey fatigue, survey fatigue. If you don't mind, I'm going to repurpose that statement of lack of action fatigue,
Mhm.
that phrase in the group, my peer groups, and within my company, and with anyone who'll listen to me
Yeah,
when it comes to talking about survey fatigue.
yeah, it's exactly it. I mean, because most surveys, let's be honest, take 10 to 15 minutes of your time.
Yeah,
So if
right.
you're doing one once a month, I mean, come on, right? And if that is leading to some kind of change, like, oh wow, now they have career paths, or oh wow, now they have best practice lunches, or oh, they
Mhm.
fixed that ladder, or now my scanner works, or now I get 2 weeks notification of my shift instead of one. If that's coming from me giving a feedback, I'm gonna just want to give you more and more.
Right.
So,
Yep.
that's the other piece I say about surveys is a survey is setting an expectation. If I'm asking you questions, I am setting the expectation that I want the answers
Right.
and I'm willing to
Yes.
change.
Yes.
So be careful what you ask if you're not
Mhm.
willing to change. Don't do a survey for survey's sake, right? I mean, it's just, and I love all the great places to work surveys and things like that. But unless you're going to leverage that data for actual change, just to get an award or just to get on the list,
Yeah.
that's not enough in my mind. It's yes, do that if you want, but then use that data to identify what your opportunities for improvement are and make the
Right.
changes. So,
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
The last example I'll share is really about talent retention. And that's, I can get my slide to move on here. That's really about, a lot of companies are struggling to keep talent, right? And they're struggling. It's a tight labor market, and we want to keep the people we have.
Right.
And so we typically recommend, doing stay interviews before you're doing exit interviews, yes, because that will help you to learn how to stop the next wave of people. It's
Mhm.
too late for those that have gone, right? The horse is bolted,
Yeah.
stable door is
Of the
shut, right?
station. Yep.
Right. But you can learn from those, what are the root causes and what can we solve so we don't lose any more. So exit surveys, I think, are valuable for that. Stay interviews are those touch points, right? They're those things that you said it earlier. How do I keep engaging my employees every day? How do I re-recruit them every day? That's what a
Mhm.
stay interview is. We've done a lot of stay interviews, but I actually recommend clients do them themselves because employees want the connection with
Yes.
you,
Yeah.
unless they feel there's some lack of trust there, right? That it's your opportunity as an HR manager to sit down and say, hey, what do you love doing here? What are you not doing enough of? Do you have a skill that's being underutilized? Where do you see yourself in a year from now? And how can we help you get there? That is talking the language of
Yep.
an employee and what they want. Um, and if you know from your analysis, like if you've done some kind of turnover analysis and you've said, all right, these are our most at-risk employees, that's where you do your stay interviews. Go figure out
Mhm.
what it is. And so I think this part of people analytics can really inform, you know, what you need to focus in on as an organization and how do you keep that talent that you have.
Yeah. And I think people, I don't know this for sure, obviously, but stay interviews can be incredibly powerful. In one of the manager classes that I did years ago, we covered stay interviews and did practices and everything. One of my students came back to me and said, I had an employee who was, in the later stages of her career, and I had tagged her as somebody who was ready to retire. And what I discovered during the stay interview is that she didn't want to retire. She wanted to do more. She wanted to learn more,
Mhm.
and she was ready to take on new work and different things than she'd done before. And had I not done that stay interview, I would have not made additional time investment in that employee because
Mhm.
I had written her off.
Yep.
So, it's so important. It's such an important and powerful tool,
Yep.
to do stay interviews with employees, especially your top talent. I mean, I think you should
Yeah.
do them with all your employees to understand, what their motivation is, and, whether you call it a stay interview or something else. The whole concept of it is to find out why your employees stay with the
Exactly.
organization.
Yeah. And stay
So,
and perform, right? Not just quit on the job. Like we've heard a lot about
right,
quiet quitting, right? And how do
yeah,
you re-engage and reconnect to people?
yeah.
But yeah, no, I think it's incredibly powerful stuff.
Yeah, no, this has been such great information, Fiona. I think, the last, 30 minutes or so that we spent together have been such an informative and practical way to address people analytics that I think a lot of us could start with. One piece or another, whether it's a stay interview, whether it's an engagement survey, whether it's just defining what it is that we want to accomplish, and then
Mhm.
talking with, leaders in our organization on how we can get there. Lots of great practical tips from today's discussion. So thank you so much for sharing your time, sharing your thoughts and ideas. Hopefully we can do one more of these sessions and talk about, now that we have the data, how do we share it?
Yeah.
What does it look like? And get into that piece around data visualization for people analytics.
Yeah, I
So
think that's the best stage, right? Is you've got
yeah,
all of this, and how do you use data to tell a story that's going to influences other people's behavior? So, a time
so
we could share about, I could talk about that all day long. So,
so we will get to that next. That'll be our next topic. Our next session will be around data visualization and telling the story with data.
Mhm.
So thanks again, Fiona,
Thank
and
you.
we will talk again soon.
Sounds great. Thank
All
you.
right, take care. Bye bye.